and madly teach. Chapter 3, The Doctrines of Modern Education. Part 3. Number 4. Modern education says, to external coercive discipline, both in conduct and choice of subject matter to be learned, must be opposed free expression of personality and free activity. The word discipline is generally understood has two meanings. It means control of conduct, and it means the process of directed training. As a disciplinarian, the teacher may be said to have two functions: the more or less negative one of maintaining formal classroom order, controlling conduct, and the other positive one of directing the pupil towards realization of selected goals, training. A natural corollary of discipline is coercion, the teacher necessarily imposing his or her will and his or her opinions on the pupil. It might be said that the cornerstone of the edifice of the progressive education movement was the denial of this conception of discipline. The early leaders of the movement stressed consistently two ideas: that control of conduct, except in the most moderate form, is harmful to the development of self-realization, and that the ongoing process of experience is more important than special results, or in other words, that means take precedence over ends. It is my understanding that the movement has retreated somewhat from this position, even in those private progressive schools that try to maintain the original faith undefiled. Two factors seem involved in this retreat. As far as classroom control is concerned, many progressive teachers have reluctantly come to the conclusion that chaotic freedom of movement and speech is a serious bar to accomplishment. And as to special results or ends, an apostate group has arisen within the movement who insist that a new social order can be brought about only by deliberate indoctrination of pupils by teachers. Public school education, which has been influenced in so many directions by the progressive movement, does not, oddly enough, give wholehearted obeisance to the dictum that control of conduct in the classroom is harmful. I think it is correct to say that, on the whole, the public schools remain traditional enough on this score, but they have been strongly affected by the other half of the progressive view of discipline. Public school teachers have become less and less guides along a well-marked path and more monitors who sit back and let the ongoing process of experience flow over the pupils, content to do a little gentle refereeing here and there. The idea seems to be that the child, or adolescent, or college youth is to be trusted to make his own wise decisions, and that it is somehow damaging to his normal development to have the teacher set the goal and determine the means of reaching it. This idea has some curious and rather unfortunate repercussions, not the least of which is the inability of so many young people nowadays to make up their minds on any issue. This trend has even been noted by a professor of education who stated during the war, quote, "Amongst the young people I teach, I find an alarmingly high proportion, even today, saying such things as, 'Who is to say that Hitler isn't right? He has his values, we have ours. They happen to be in conflict with ours, so we have to fight him, but that doesn't mean he is wrong.'" Unquote. This professor believes such an attitude is induced by an education that fails to develop moral understanding. But of course he hastens to add that it is traditional education that is at fault. I am sure that in this regard traditional education is not blameless, but certainly its system of values was more nearly fixed than the relative system of the modernists. Certainly it discriminated more rigidly between right and wrong than does modern education. This attitude of moral skepticism of which the professor complains is nowhere more in evidence than in dealing with controversial social questions, a field in which the modern educator thinks he operates much more realistically than did the old-fashioned schoolman. These questions are usually presented by the teacher with an elaborate effort towards objectivity and disinterestedness, but with little attempt to trace their historical antecedents, and with no attempt to resolve them. To attempt this is to commit the modern educational sin of assuming there are ultimate values in the light of which issues may sometimes be decided. The last thing the student will get from this kind of teaching is moral understanding. He will emerge from it inevitably a moral skeptic, certain only that all things are relative, and that the terms right and wrong bear no relation to the realities of the social world. Another result of the modern view of discipline is overvaluation of the pupil's judgment of what he or she should learn. On the college level, this idea was introduced into American education by Charles W. Eliot with the elective system at Harvard, and since then it has seeped down into the secondary and even the elementary schools. The modern educator feels he can overcome any possible evils of this system by guidance programs that will gently steer all pupils into the right courses. But does not the assumption remain that education is like merchandise for which you shop around until you find something to your taste? What is perhaps the most regrettable result is impossible to describe in concrete terms. It is a sort of subtle atmosphere that seems to permeate schools where the new discipline is practiced. I think it is an atmosphere of plaintive bewilderment, for I believe that young people, no matter how irksome they may find it at the time, depend on direction and leadership and are at a loss when it is withheld from them. When you are a child or adolescent, it is fun to be treated like a grown-up on occasion. But as you are not a grown-up, it is far more satisfying, psychologically, as a steady diet, to have your real status acknowledged. In schools, as in homes where the child is treated with unnatural equality, he will, in the end, compensate for the loss of his childhood status by becoming a minor tyrant, making himself or herself and those about him or her unhappy. In all too many cases, the child-centered school has today become the child-dominated school. Perhaps one who is not a psychologist of adolescence should avoid all ex cathedra utterances on the nature of youth, but certainly common sense would concur in the statement that the child is not, to use Jacques Maritain's expression, a dwarf man operating on the adult level, and that therefore he requires the active and purposeful guidance of a person of mature experience. This point of view is scoffed at by modern educators as, quote, authoritarian and, quote, reactionary, which are unpleasant terms. But until educators recognize its validity, they may as well, as Robert M. Hutchins has written, quote, be prepared to confess that they are nothing but chaperones, supervising an aimless trial and error process, which is chiefly valuable because it keeps young people from doing something worse, unquote. Perhaps modern teachers are a little frightened by the word discipline. Certainly some of the practices committed in its name in the past had the grim stamp of Calvinistic theology on them. And even when grounded on more humane considerations, it was not always motivated by higher sentiments than those expressed by a Boston matron, circa 1912, in the play version of Marquand's The Late George Apley, who said, "Children don't know what they want. It's really very simple. You just tell them." The revolt against discipline among the progressive group was born largely in outrage at the harshnesses of the older education. It was a revolt based on a warm-hearted and humane feeling for children as individuals. Unfortunately, this feeling became a hard and fast principle of pedagogy. Some discipline is arbitrary and cruel. Ergo, all discipline is bad, so ran the refrain of these early revolutionaries. Exaggerated as is this view, it could result in a net gain if it would cause schoolmen to consider the whole matter of discipline and to arrive at a moderate middle view. To think of discipline as something to be imposed with enlightened and patient common sense, with individual enrichment, not social solidarity is its aim. Traditional education does not yet entirely take this view. Catholic education, for example, which is much to be admired for its sound classical background, its philosophical and schematic unity, and its devotion to human and spiritual ideals, seems to place too much value on esprit de corps, on a discipline that sometimes seems to aim at collective thinking and even collective piety. Discipline is not an adult conspiracy against children. It is a responsibility adults owe to children. I cannot do better than to quote again Jacques Maritain, who sums up admirably what I have been trying to say on this subject. Maritain says, "The plastic and suggestible freedom of the child is harmed and led astray if it is not helped and guided. An education which consisted in making the child responsible for acquiring information about that of which he does not know he is ignorant, an education which only contemplated a blossoming forth of the child's instincts, and which rendered the teacher a tractable and useless attendant, is but a bankruptcy of education, and of the responsibility of adults toward the youth. The right of the child to be educated requires that the educator shall have moral authority over him, and this authority is nothing else than the duty of the adult to the freedom of the youth." Number 5. Modern education says, "It is the duty of the schools to train youth for vocations." Those who believe in vocational training in the schools divide themselves into two groups. Perhaps the larger group, including the various subsidiary associations of schoolmen affiliated with the National Education Association, believe that the schools can train for specific occupations. The other group places more emphasis on general work experience in the belief that every individual needs to learn manual dexterity. To the first group, we can direct one question. What specific occupations will you train for? If I remember correctly, there are some 25,000 different kinds of occupations in this country. And even if narrowed down to training in the kinds of occupations prevalent in a particular community, the number will be far too high for the school to include them all. As for the argument of the second group, it seems to me that American youth for generations has been learning manual dexterity very effectively without the aid of the schools. Who taught Americans to drive automobiles? Where did American youth get their genius for tinkering with machinery? These and 100 other skills young people pick up naturally and easily, without formal instruction, by observing their elders or by learning from each other. A great many vocational skills, especially for specific occupations, can be far better and far more quickly learned on the job. And I believe most employers would prefer this procedure. Not only does vocational training deprive the student of time that should be utilized for serious study, but it also deprives the school system of large sums of money which are needed for these genuine educational purposes. Boards of education, notoriously parsimonious when it comes to teachers' salaries, can be quite liberal in spending money for equipping elaborate home economics and shop rooms. It is not uncommon to find schools where tens of thousands of dollars have been invested in equipment for woodworking and metalworking, electrical apparatus, and equipment for automobile repairing, while the teaching staff is being paid below the prevailing rate. Equipment is showy and tangible evidence of an up-and-coming school, I suppose. But it is the first-rate teacher who has the greatest influence on human material. The results obtained from vocational training simply do not justify the expenditure. And speaking of costs in this connection, let me quote a minor example of current educational nonsense. The taxpayers of the state of Connecticut are permitted to read a pamphlet recently prepared at their expense by the Department of Education and devoted to an exposition of what is termed, quote, the science of occupationology, end quote. And the reader is assured that the possibilities of the application of this new science that lie ahead stagger the imagination. One can well believe that. Our modern educator may ask in a shocked tone, but isn't it the duty of the school to prepare the youth to earn his living? To this I would answer that preparation for earning one's living is part of education. Where I would differ with the educator is in defining preparation for livelihood. The individual who is best prepared for any kind of occupation is one whose intelligence has been so well trained that he is able to adapt himself or herself to any situation, and whose point of view has been so humanized by his or her education that he will be a good person in any job or calling. And these qualities are the result only of a liberalizing education. This idea has been well expressed by Stringfellow Barr, who says, "The man who has learned to practice these arts successfully, the arts of liberal education, can concentrate on anything, can apply himself to anything, can quickly learn any specialty, any profession, any business. That man can deliberate, can make practical decisions by other means than tossing a coin, can understand his failures, can recognize his obligations as well as his opportunities. He is, in short, what an earlier generation eloquently termed an educated man." I think there is some evidence that employers who have been sold on vocational training are coming around to the point of view that the sort of person described by Mr. Barr makes the best employee. I think many of them realize that the great menace of specialization is competence without intelligence. I remember talking with an official of an airplane factory during the war who complained that many of his men were mechanically competent in dealing with a specific task laid out for them, but seemed to lack the ability to deal independently with new problems. They were lost without recourse to a ready-made formula. They lacked adaptability, a primary requisite for which is a cultivated intelligence. American educators talk eloquently about democracy and the democratic right of all to education. But it seems to me that what they are actually talking about is the democratic right of all to some kind of education. They betray as profound a distrust of the ability of all youth to take education as did the late Albert J. Nock, who felt that most people were subhuman and that only an infinitesimal portion of the population is educable. An idea, incidentally, shared by the great Democrat Thomas Jefferson, who advocated a system of competitive schools which would weed out what he rather undemocratically called rubbish. By the way, I trust no one who is not acquainted with the writings of Mr. Nock will be discouraged from reading him by this harsh quotation. He was a charming, if somewhat crotchety essayist, many of whose writings touch on educational matters. His book, The Theory of Education in the United States, a new edition is being published by Henry Regnery Company, remains a little classic in its field, and his autobiography, Memoirs of a Superfluous Man, is well worth reading for his attitude on many subjects, including education. I wonder, however, if the insistence on including vocational training in the schools didn't arise in part from the conviction, fortified by the results obtained by scientifically determining intelligence, that education is beyond the ability of many to absorb, and that something must be found to occupy their time. If so, what could be more undemocratic? This brings me back to the idea I have stated before, perhaps with wearying repetition. If we really believe in the values of education, we must believe they are good for everyone. This is not to say that everyone has the same abilities and capacities, but only that everyone has the same needs that can never be met by vocational training, but only by a humanizing and liberalizing education.